700 WLW Podcast. Check out Mike McConnell weekday mornings 9 to noon on 700 WLW.
All right, I have a guest standing by on the definitive book, I'll say the definitive book, on the Kennedy assassination. Well-known prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi joins me, the author of the book, Reclaiming History. And first of all, welcome. Good to have you here, sir.
Happy to be on the show, Mike.
The idea behind Reclaiming History, the title would be that we can finally get back to some sanity as to exactly how President Kennedy met his demise. Yeah,
the dedication to the book, I noted that nothing in the present can exist without the paternity of history, and therefore the latter, referring to history, is sacred and should never be tampered with or defiled by untruths. And I've never seen any major event that I'm aware of in world history that has been shrouded in so much intentional misinformation as this case. The conspiracy theorists have been very successful. They've convinced the majority of Americans, 75% of the American people actually believe there's a conspiracy in this case, and that's just silliness. All of the evidence, not some of it or most of it, all of it shows that Oswald killed Kennedy, and there's no credible evidence after close to 44 years that any group was behind Oswald. We all know, Mike, that 3 people can keep a secret, but only if 2 are dead. And after close to 44 years, not one word, not one syllable has leaked out. And if we have time on the show, I'll go and I'll try to summarize these billions and billions of words as to why that have been written on the case, as to why I feel Oswald was guilty and there's no conspiracy. I don't know if we're going to have time for that.
Well, we'll do our best. I just want to make this point, as I've made to other conspiracy theorists. They like to start with a suspect and work their way backward. When you're investigating a crime, you go to the scene of the crime, you begin to gather evidence from there, and it takes you in a direction.
That's right. They're basic theories that if someone had a motive, that must mean that they must have committed the assassination.
Right.
And Oliver Stone, with his thinking cap turned very tightly to the off position, he comes up with 10 groups that had a motive, and he has all 10 involved in the assassination. If the current president were killed tomorrow, you could come up with all types of people and groups who did not like him, and you could say, well, I guess they're suspects in his murder. But that's silly. As a former prosecutor, I can tell you that motive is really important if you can show that that person is the only person on the face of the earth that had a motive to do it. But otherwise, it's just a starting point. Somewhere along the line, you got to pay the piper and show that the person that you say had a motive actually committed the crime, and you can only do that with evidence, and there is no evidence that any of these groups were involved in the assassination.
I almost don't know where to begin. Obviously, the book is a piece of work. It's 1,500 pages, I think, before the footnotes.
Well, the footnotes are at the bottom of the page. Actually, the book is about 1,600 pages, but then there's endnotes in a CD. That's another 1,125 pages.
Yeah.
And the reason for the length, Mike, is that this is the first book that covers the entire case. No book up to this point has even attempted to cover the entire case. The second reason is that although this is a simple case, to this very day, it's a very simple case, and everyone in Dallas law enforcement knew within hours that Oswald killed Kennedy and acted alone, there's a second reality. And what that second reality is, Mike, is that because of the unceasing and fanatical obsession of literally, this is not an exaggeration, thousands upon thousands of Warren Commission critics and conspiracy theorists who have investigated every conceivable aspect of this case for close to 44 years and made hundreds and hundreds of allegations, this simple case, which remains simple at its core, has been transformed into its present state. And its present state is that this is the most complex murder case by far in world history. Nothing even remotely comes close. Just to give you an example, in manuscript form, one of my endnotes, I'm not talking about the main text now, just an endnote on acoustics, ran 120 pages with about 60 footnotes. But that's because of these allegations which never end. As I'm talking to you right now,
somebody's dreaming something
up. There's 100 people out there looking at documents, every comma and every period, and looking for some hint of a conspiracy. It never, ever, ever ends.
All right, if you had to pick the one big lie that perhaps goes off into different tangents looking for different suspects, what might that be?
There's so many lies.
Well, I mean, the first one I heard was the first one I heard was there's no way that one individual can squeeze off that many shots with that particular weapon in such a short period of time.
Yeah, that's one of the lies. In that same context, they say that Oswald was a poor shot, couldn't hit the broadside of a barn.
Right.
Actually, Oswald in the Marines was a sharpshooter. He fired a .212. As far as the difficulty of what he did there, he wasn't that accurate. He was aiming at the president's head. He fired 3 shots. The first shot missed. The second shot, if you're aiming at the head, which is the most vulnerable part of the body, missed again, hit the upper right back, exited the front of the throat. The third shot hit him in the head, so he's 1 out of 3. Close range. And I've been up to that window. The president was almost a stationary target, because if you hold an imaginary rifle in your hand, the barrel of that rifle is on a straight line down Elm Street. The vehicle's only traveling 11 miles an hour. There's a declination of Elm Street of 3.9 degrees, which eliminates the necessity of elevating the muzzle as you get further away from the window. It was not that tough a shot. As far as the duplication, no one's ever duplicated it. That's just an outright lie. At the time of the Warren Commission, a specialist Miller in the Army duplicated Oswald in 1967. CBS had several people attempted to do it. One not only equaled Oswald, beat him, did better than Oswald. In 1986, when I, quote, prosecuted Oswald in London, Jerry Spence defended him. My firearms guy from Wisconsin not only duplicated Oswald, but beat him. It's just one lie after another that they've told about this case.
Yeah, Dealey Plaza is one of those areas, I've been there myself, that looks much bigger in film or on television than it is in reality. From that 6th floor window down is really, I've said it before, you could have hit the president with a Nerf football. Of course.
The head shot was 88 yards, and the shot that entered the upper right back at about 59 yards. And on the range, as you know, when you're firing for record, it's 100 yards, 200, 300, and 500. So this was not a difficult shot. And even as it was, he only hit the target. We assume he's aiming at the head 1 out of 3 times.
All right, then what about the magic bullet? That's the one we hear time and again, the magic bullet.
Okay, let's talk about the magic bullet. What the conspiracy theorists do, and this is just an unbelievable lie on their part. I mean, it shows how gross and how blatant they are. In their sketches, they place Connally directly in front of President Kennedy. And then they say a shot coming from the right rear, where Oswald supposedly was, passing through soft tissue in Kennedy's body on a straight line, exiting the throat. To hit Connally, the bullet would have to make a right turn in midair and then a left turn to go on to hit Connally. Of course, if you start out with an erroneous premise, Mike, everything that follows makes a heck of a lot of sense. The only problem is that it's wrong. Mm-hmm. Connally was not seated, and they know this because the Zapruder Film shows this, and hundreds of photographs show this, and I have photographs in the book. Connally was not seated directly in front of Kennedy. He was seated to his left front in a jump seat. So a shot coming from the right rear, passing through soft tissue, had nowhere else to go except to hit John Connally. There was nothing magic about that bullet at all. In London, Spence had a doctor, Dr. Cyril Wecht, testify to the magic bullet. And on cross-examination, I said, now, Dr. Wecht, you say the bullet passed through Kennedy's body. You admit that on a straight line, and yet you say it did not go on to hit Connally because it couldn't have. It had to make a right turn in midair. I said, well, if what you say is true, then why didn't it tear up the bullet, tear up the interior of the limousine, or hit the driver? He says, I don't know. I says, well, then if it didn't hit Connally, it didn't hit the interior of the limousine, didn't hit the driver, I said, it sounds like you have a magic bullet. It sounds like the bullet must have zigzagged to the left. And he says, no, it did not zigzag to the left. I said, well, did it hop, skip, and jump over the car? He said, no, it didn't have to perform any type of remarkable feat like that. I said, well, then what happened to that bullet? He says, I don't know. So if we follow the conspiracy theorists, they're the only ones that have a magic bullet because it exits the president's throat, and apparently, Mike, it vanishes without a trace into thin air.
It hits nothing else.
Yeah, they're the ones that have the magic bullet, and yet they've hung this magic bullet tag around the Warren Commission's neck for close to 44 years. They're the only ones that have a magic bullet.
Then you have those who would say the doctors that performed the autopsy were a couple of rookies. They didn't know what they were doing. They botched the autopsy. What about the credentials of those who performed the autopsy?
Well, they all were very, very prominent pathologists. However, it is true that two of them were not forensic pathologists, but everyone conveniently forgets the fact that the third pathologist was a forensic pathologist. Dr. Pierre Fink, had a lot of experience in this type of a gunshot wound death, and he was there, and his sole purpose at that autopsy was to examine those wounds, whether they were entrance or exit wounds. So everyone forgets about Pierre Fink. He was a forensic pathologist. Many other pathologists throughout the years, the Clark Commission, the House Select Committee had 9 pathologists, looked at the autopsy photographs and x-rays and came to the same identical conclusion as the 3 autopsy surgeons.
Mm-hmm. And then to the whole idea, and I've been through this time and again because I've seen this displayed using things such as a watermelon. The question is, if the president wasn't shot from the front, namely the grassy knoll,
right,
how could his head have been thrust backward? And every time I've seen this with a watermelon or a cantaloupe and it's shot from the back, say it's shot from the left, it does lurch to the left.
Yeah, if you look at the film itself, and Spence in London showed the jury that sequence there 5 times, and I didn't object. And he said, Mr. Bugliosi, with his fancy witnesses, is trying to convince you folks that you didn't see what you saw with your own eyes. He's saying that you really didn't see that. And he says it's obvious that he was, he says Oswald, according to Mr. Bugliosi, is to the rear, the grassy knoll to the right front, and we see the head snap to the rear. Obviously the shot came from the front. He says it looked like Babe Ruth struck the president with a bat, knocking his head to the rear. Mm-hmm. If you look at the individual, and if I hadn't overcome that, the verdict in London would have been not guilty. As it was, the Dallas jury came back with a verdict of guilty. If you look at the individual frames, and I show them in Reclaiming History, I show the individual frames. At 312, and this has never been shown before in any other book. It's in the Warren Commission volumes, but in no other book. You look at 312, the president's head's okay. At frame 313, 1/18th of a second later, you see the explosion to his head. And in what direction is his head pushed at frame 313? It's pushed forward. It's put not backwards, but forward. Mm-hmm. So at the all-important point or moment of impact, Mike, that's the all-important moment that you cannot see on the film. You have to look at the individual frames. The head at impact is pushed forward. 2.3 inches between 312 and 313. And then at 314 to 321, there's the neuromuscular reaction causing the head snap to the rear. But at the all-important moment of impact, which I showed the jury in London, the president's head was pushed forward, indicating what? A shot from the rear.
As far as getting back to Oswald, Oswald is believed to have killed somebody in just weeks prior to President Kennedy. Is that accurate?
No, about 7 months before that, he tried to murder Major General Edwin Walker, who was a member of the John Birch Society, and he fired at night. The lights in the room were on, and he didn't see too clearly. He didn't see the windowsill, and he was outside the home, and he fired at Walker's head, but the bullet was deflected by the windowsill and just missed Walker's head. So he tried to murder Major General Edwin Walker. Walker's on the far right. Oswald's on the far left, and the far left shooting at the far right. That made sense, but people said, well, wait a while, Kennedy was not on the far right. Why in the world would Oswald try to kill President Kennedy? But Walker and Kennedy, there was a common denominator there. They both were strongly anti-Castro, and Oswald revered Castro. He was a very ardent supporter of the Cuban Revolution, and Kennedy was certainly supportive and behind the Bay of Pigs invasion, trying to overthrow Castro. 5 days before the assassination, Kennedy gave a speech in Miami urging the Cuban people to rise up against Castro and promising prompt U.S. aid if they did. So there was a little animus, not too much by Oswald against Kennedy. He liked Kennedy's position on civil rights, but he certainly was against Kennedy for his anti-Castro position. But there was another issue here, and if we have time to get into it, I looked at his...
Yeah, I'll tell you what, let me get this break in, then specific to motive. How about that?
All right, good.
Great. My guest once again is Vincent Bugliosi, and the new book is Reclaiming History. It's 1,600 pages of everything you ever wanted to know about the Kennedy assassination. Stand by. We'll be right back. Well, the promised clouds are here. Chance for shower or thunderstorm, 61 the high. Overnight, an evening shower, then becoming partly cloudy, 41. Tomorrow, partly cloudy, 66. And a good-looking weekend, 70s both days. And 53 right now, 700 WLW. All right, Mike McConnell, my guest once again is Vincent Bugliosi, renowned prosecutor. He was the prosecutor in the Charles Manson case. Had a best-selling book on the O.J. Simpson case. The new one is 1,600 pages looking back at the Kennedy assassination, coming to the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald did it and acted alone. We're talking here as to Oswald's motive. It had to be something just above and beyond.
Well, as I say,
Castro.
he had a capacity for violence, and here's someone that wanted really to change the world. But looking at his diary, I found one entry that leapt off the pages to me, and probably my prosecution of Manson had some relevance here. Manson, as you know, the people whom he killed, he did not know these people. He didn't kill them personally, but he ordered their murder.
Yeah.
But they were representative of a society that he hated. He was very anti-establishment, and he knew they were establishment figures. So it was kind of a representative type of killing. It wasn't personal in that he did not know these people. And I'm looking at Oswald's diary there, and he had two entries. One said that anyone who lives as I have under capitalism and communism has got to be opposed to both systems. And then he goes on to say in a second entry that he, quote, he says, I despise the representatives. That was the key word that leaped off the pages to me, or leapt off the pages. I despise the representatives of both systems. So I argued to the jury in London, without knowing, because who knows exactly what was going on in his fevered mind,
Right.
that even though he may not have hated Kennedy, and of course Spence made that argument, we do know that he hated the United States of America. I mean, he expressed that hatred many, many times. And I argued that one possibility that contributed to this is that when he was firing at Kennedy, Kennedy was the quintessential representative of a society for which he held a grinding contempt. And as he was shooting at Kennedy, he was shooting at the United States of America. We don't know his exact motive. I mean, I've put people on death row without knowing what their motive was. All I knew is that they'd put someone in their grave 6 feet under, and they had no legal justification for doing it. But to know their exact motive, sometimes you don't know that. But we do know that Oswald killed Kennedy, and he acted alone.
Well, in this case, his opportunity to act came along rather suddenly. He hadn't been with the book depository that long. He could have been told to work at a different location on that given day.
Absolutely.
In his mind, was it just a matter of, wow, that motorcade's coming by here, I'm in this window, I could do this.
Yeah.
It probably came together that quickly.
Yeah, that's right. His rendezvous with history, and he could not pass it up. The motorcade route was not even determined until November 18th, 1963, which is 4 days before the assassination. Now, does anyone really believe that the CIA or mob is going to conspire with Oswald to kill Kennedy within 4 days of the assassination? That's just pure nonsense.
Yeah, a lot of people, some younger people, don't realize that they used to always publicize the route of a motorcade. And kids would get out of school and go wave to the president. You knew which way the car was going. Today they closed down the highway. Nobody's out there. The president's in and out of town. But it didn't used to be that way.
Yeah, the following day, November 19th, the motorcade route was in the Dallas Morning News. But no rational person can possibly believe that these people got together with Oswald within a couple days of the assassination and decided to kill him. Have I gone into some of the reasons why it's just impossible that they would even go to Oswald? Have I talked about that, Mike?
No, I'll tell you what, I want to get a break in here in about 30 seconds and then have an opportunity to get into some of that. I also want to mention that you spent some time re-interviewing witnesses who had been interviewed in the past, and I'll be curious to see if there are people who believe that over time things they say have been distorted or whatever the questions may be.
Mm-hmm.
Stand by if you would. The book is out. It is called Reclaiming History, 1,600 pages looking back at the Warren Commission and evidence as to who shot John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and the conclusion is it was Lee Harvey Oswald and nobody else. Details, even more details to come. Mike McCollum, my guest once again, is renowned prosecutor and author Vincent Bugliosi. The new book is called Reclaiming History, where he takes an exhaustive look over 20 years at evidence involving the John F. Kennedy assassination. And I want to thank you for holding over for this segment. Two things we brought up. Number one, you wanted to talk about why it would be ridiculous for any of the other supposed suspects to work with Oswald on this, whether it's the mob or whether it's the Cubans or whoever the case may be.
Yeah. There is no credible evidence that any of these groups, like the military-industrial complex, the mob, the CIA, no credible evidence that any of these groups were behind the assassination, number one. All we have is naked speculation. Mm-hmm. Number two, there's absolutely no evidence that Oswald ever had any connection or association with any of these groups that supposedly were behind the assassination. And I can tell you, Mike, that once the assassination took place, the FBI checked every breath this guy ever breathed from the moment he arrived back from Russia. He arrived, I think, on June 13th, 1962. From that date on to the date of the assassination, they checked everything this guy ever did. And there's no record, no evidence of any association that this guy had with the CIA or the mob or anyone like that.
Right.
But let's take it a step further. Let's say that one of these groups decided, let's murder President Kennedy. That's the type of thing that you'd find in a Robert Ludlum novel, and I reject it out of hand, although in my book I cover it in great depth. But let's assume that they decide to kill President Kennedy. Oswald would be one of the last guys in the world they would go to. Why? Well, number one, he was not an expert shot. He wasn't a bad shot, but he was not an expert shot, and you'd want to have an expert if you were going to pull off the biggest murder in American history. Mm-hmm. He's got a $12 mail order rifle. He's notoriously unreliable, extremely unstable. Have I mentioned the fact that he tried to commit suicide over in Russia? Did I get into that?
No, but he's unstable.
Okay, well, he tried to become a Soviet citizen when he defected to the Soviet Union. They turned him down. What does he do? He slashes his wrists, tries to commit suicide. This is the type of guy you're going to go to, of course, if you want to commit the biggest crime in American history. Let's take it a step further and say the CIA or mob or what have you decides, let's murder Kennedy, and for whatever crazy reason, let's get Lee Harvey Oswald to do it. Let's see if where that takes us, Mike, makes any sense. After Oswald shot Kennedy and left the book depository building, one of two things would have happened. The least likely thing that would have happened, I'll give you that first. The least likely thing is that there would have been a car there to help him escape, drive him down to Mexico or wherever. That's the least likely thing that would have happened. The most likely thing that would have happened.
They'd have killed him.
By far, right. There would have been a car there that would have driven him to his death.
Right.
Instead, he's out on the street, as we know, with $13 in his pocket, trying to flag down buses and cabs, you know. That fact alone shows you that it's preposterous, the notion that the CIA got this guy to kill Kennedy.
All right, so let's jump ahead to Ruby, who people would claim was there for the purpose of silencing Oswald, and that's why he killed him.
Yeah. Well, when you say silencing Oswald for the mob, that presupposes by definition that Oswald killed Kennedy for the mob. If he didn't, why would there be any reason to silence him? And there's no evidence, again, that Oswald killed Kennedy for the mob. As far as Jack Ruby is concerned, the FBI and the Warren Commission checked this guy out completely thoroughly, found no evidence that this guy was a member of organized crime. He did have pretensions like that. He'd like to impress people that he had mob connections and stuff like that. And he came from the streets of Chicago, and he'd wear a fedora hat the way Al Capone used to wear. Mm-hmm. But he passed a polygraph test, not that that's conclusive, on the issue of whether he killed Oswald for the for the mob. But if they were looking for a hitman to kill Oswald, this was a terrible, terrible hitman. Just like Oswald would have been a terrible hitman, Ruby was terrible. Why? I'll tell you why. Number one, he was very, very close to Dallas law enforcement. He had many, this is not an exaggeration. It's been said that over half of the Dallas police officers on that force knew Jack Ruby. He was a police officer buff. He was hanging out at the station. Many of them hung out at his club. He loved the police. He was very close to them. Also, he was a notorious blabbermouth. He would snitch to the police on anyone he thought was committing a crime. So that's not the guy you go to commit the second biggest murder in American history. Right. Also, he was mentally and emotionally unbalanced, very much so. He had a violent temper. He was fighting people at the club all the time, throwing them down the stairs. He had organic brain damage. He had 7 dogs, 6 of whom he called his children, the 7th his wife. Jack Revelle was the detective in charge of the Criminal Investigation Division of the Dallas Police Department, and he testified before the House Select Committee in '78, and he said, Jack Ruby is a buffoon, or was a buffoon, and I tell this committee this. He says, if Jack Ruby was a member of organized crime, then the personnel director of organized crime should be replaced. and it's interesting to note. It's interesting to note, Mike, that the FBI interviewed well over 100 people who knew Ruby very well. And they literally laugh at the suggestion that this guy was a member of organized crime and silenced Oswald for the mob. They laugh at it. Not one of them entertained that thought for a moment. And yet these conspiracy theorists around the country in Topeka and Sheboygan never knew Ruby, never met him, and yet they're convinced that he was this big-time mobster that silenced Oswald for the mob. Why did he kill Oswald? Well, I think we can just about tell you why he did. Ruby loved President Kennedy. His psychiatrist said literally he loved the man. His sister said that about that. He thought that Kennedy was the greatest man who ever lived. He took Kennedy's death very hard. He hated Oswald. Well, for what he said when they were right after he shot Oswald, he said, "Well, someone had to kill that son of a blank." So certainly his hatred for Oswald and his love for Kennedy played a role, I think, in his... Well,
then he had opportunity because he hung around the station house and knew the cops.
They all recognized him. In fact, the first time when they first saw him down there, before he pulled the trigger, one of the detectives said, "Jack, you son of a, don't do this." But they knew exactly who he was. But there's another reason why he may have done it. In addition to what I just told you, Jack thought he was going to become a big hero. Those who knew him well said Jack, was one of these guys. He liked to take justice into his own hands. He was an avenger, and he thought he was going to be a big hero here. The jury that convicted him for killing Oswald, many of them said he thought he was going to be a hero. The prosecutor, whom I've gotten to know fairly well, Bill Alexander, said there's no question that Jack thought he was going to become a hero. In his jail cell, he was seeking an agent. He thought there was going to be a big movie and a book about his heroic deeds. His first lawyer said that, Jack never even thought he was going to be punished for this. He thought he'd get a slap on the wrist and he'd be back at the Carousel Club in a couple of weeks, greeting people from around the world who wanted to shake the hands of the man who killed the man who killed the president. Yeah. So it's all silly nonsense, and yet this nonsense has been translated into 75% of the American people reject the findings of the Warren Commission. Only 19% accept the findings. And as the LA Times and the reviews said, that reclaiming history may finally move those accusations beyond civilized debate. It's all silliness, sublime silliness.
That's good news. Yeah, Reclaiming History, the book. My guest for about another minute would be the author, Vince Bugliosi. Since I asked you before, did you interview anybody who feels that over time things they said back in the day have been misconstrued, taken out of context, or were they the victim of an outright lie?
Well, not off the top of my head did I interview anyone that said that I said something that has been. I'm sure there's something in the close to 3,000 pages, but I can tell you this. This happened many times. Yeah. A witness would say something at the time of the assassination, then 10, 15, 20 years later come up with a different story. They changed their story. One example, Jean Hill. She said at the time of the assassination, she thought the shots came from the grassy knoll. Many people did, because Dealey Plaza resounded with echoes, and you just couldn't tell the origin of fire.
Right.
But she didn't see anyone or anything like that. And then 20 years later, she said, "Oh yeah, I saw someone firing at him, and I saw the fire coming out of the barrel and all that stuff." Comes up with this completely bogus story 20 years later. There's all types of people that come up with a news story 5, 10, 15, 20 years later. But as far as you're saying, did someone claim they were misquoted? I'm sure that's in my book. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, listen, our time is up. I appreciate all of yours, and
thank you so much.
It was a burden to write that book. I'll tell you what, because it's a burden to lift it too.
Yeah, people have said it's my baby, and it weighs 7 pounds. And I guess that's the size of it. That's the normal weight of a baby.
It's all in there.
But it's a 20-year effort. I appreciate it, Mike. Thank you.
You betcha.
So much.
Vince Bugliosi, thank you. Take care. Be right back.